The silence that spoke everything. The cameras were rolling. The lights were blinding. And yet, something about that day felt heavy, like the set itself was holding its breath. Sydney Sweeney had always been strong, ever since she walked into Hollywood's unpredictable storm. She carried her emotions like armor. But that morning, even the makeup artist noticed something wasn't right. Sydney's smile was soft, too soft, like it had been stitched over something aching beneath the surface. She sat quietly in her trailer, fingers trembling around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. The scene was supposed to be emotional, but fiction and reality were starting to blur. She wasn't sure anymore which tears were part of the script, and which belonged to her, outside. Keanu Reeves was already on set, rehearsing lines with the director. He was calm, grounded, kind as he always was. No one had to say it, but everyone knew that whenever something went wrong, Keanu was the quiet strength people leaned on. The kind of presence that didn't demand attention, but gave it freely. When Sydney finally stepped onto the set, her eyes were red. The cinematographer adjusted the lighting, the sound guy tested the mics, and the assistant director gave the usual call for quiet. But something cracked. They were just about to start shooting when Sydney froze. Her voice wouldn't come. Her body stiffened. The scene required a monologue, a raw, vulnerable one, but she couldn't say a single word. Not because she forgot. Not because she didn't prepare. But because something inside her had finally reached its limit. Her breathing became shallow. The silence around her thickened. People started to notice. "Cut," the director said gently, walking toward her. "Are you okay?" But she didn't answer. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't form. Then she broke. Right there. In front of the crew, she collapsed onto the floor, not dramatically, but softly, like a fragile branch finally giving in to the weight of too much rain. No one moved, except Keanu. He didn't rush. He didn't say anything. He simply walked over and sat beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't ask questions. He just sat in complete silence. The set stood still. It wasn't a gesture meant for attention. It wasn't rehearsed or guided by any manager or publicist. It was human, real, unfiltered. And maybe that's why it mattered so much. After a few minutes, Sydney finally looked at him. Her face was streaked with tears, her breathing still shaky. Keanu looked back, his eyes soft, patient, kind. He gave a small nod as if to say, "You don't have to talk. I'm just here." She let out a quiet, painful laugh. Not because anything was funny, but because someone had finally seen her. Without needing her to perform, "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded again, still not speaking. And then, for the next 20 minutes, they just sat there, two actors. Two souls, no cameras rolling, no lights blaring, just sharing a quiet moment in a noisy world. No one on set dared to interrupt. When the director finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "We can shoot this another day." Sydney shook her head. "No," she said softly, wiping her face. "I want to try again, but this time just let the camera run. No cuts." And so they did. This time when she delivered her lines, something had changed. There was a tremble in her voice that made the entire room lean in. She wasn't acting anymore. She was just telling the truth through the character. The pain, the pause, the rise and fall of every word, it was real. And everyone felt it. When the scene ended, no one clapped. No one needed to. The silence was more powerful than any applause. Keanu stood beside her again, not as a co-star, not as a mentor, but as a friend. And sometimes that's all a person needs. Not advice, not solutions, just someone to sit beside them in the silence. Behind the applause, beyond the masks, day after Sydney's breakdown on set, things felt different, not just for her, but for everyone around her. The makeup artist was gentler. The lighting crew was quieter. The entire production had shifted. Its energy. Like they were suddenly walking around something sacred. But Sydney wasn't hiding anymore. She walked onto the set with a strange sense of peace. Her eyes still looked tired, but her shoulders weren't as tight. She knew everyone had seen her cry, and oddly, she didn't feel embarrassed about it. Not after Keanu sat with her. Not after that silence. That silence had said everything. Between scenes, Keanu offered her a cup of warm tea. No sugar, just how she liked it. He didn't say much, he never did, but the gesture meant more than 100 scripted lines. Later that evening, the director called for a short break. Sydney wandered off to the side of the lot, near the old trailers where no one went anymore. She just needed space to breathe. But after a few minutes, she heard footsteps, slow, careful ones. It was Keanu. He didn't ask permission, just stood beside her again, looking at the sky. "You were strong yesterday," he said quietly. "I didn't feel strong," Sydney replied. "You don't have to feel strong to be strong." She turned to him, her eyes filled with questions. "How do you do it? Do what? Stay so calm, so grounded? People look at you like you're this rock, this unshakable person. How do you carry all that?" Keanu took a deep breath, then smiled in that small, knowing way of his. "'Cause I know what it's like to fall apart." He didn't say it like a confession. He said it like a truth he had lived with for a long time. "Everyone thinks I'm peaceful," he continued. "But peace isn't something I was born with, something I built after losing everything I once loved." Sydney felt her breath. Ketchy had read about his past, about the loss of his daughter, his partner, his closest friends. But hearing him speak about it, not as headlines, but as memories, it hit different. "I thought I was broken," he said, "for years. And then one day, someone sat beside me and said nothing. Just like I did for you." "Who?" Sydney asked. "My sister. She didn't try to fix me. She didn't give me advice. She just sat there and let me feel like a person." Again, that changed everything. For a moment, Sydney didn't speak. The sun was dipping behind the hills, casting a golden hue over the trailers. The silence returned, but this time, it felt safe. "You know," she said finally, "I used to think that crying was weakness. That if people saw me break, they'd think I didn't belong here. But I wasn't enough. You're more than enough," Keanu said. "You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be human." She looked down at her hands. They were still trembling slightly, but she wasn't hiding them anymore. "Yesterday," she said, "I wasn't acting. The lines were from the script, but the pain, that was mine. That's why it was powerful." Just then, a crew member came looking for them. "They're ready for the next shot," he said. Keanu looked at Sydney. "You good?" Nodded. "Better than yesterday." They walked back together side by side. No cameras on them, no spotlight, just two people who had seen each other beyond the surface. As they returned to set, someone clapped quietly. It wasn't for a performance. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the costume designer. It's an older woman who had seen dozens of productions and rarely spoke up. "That was real," she said simply. Sydney smiled. Not the kind of smile meant for press photos, but something softer, truer, that evening, after. Wrap. She opened her phone and looked at a message she'd typed days ago, but never sent. It was meant for her mother. They hadn't spoken in months. A fight over something small had stretched into silence. Now, for the first time, Sydney realized, she didn't want that silence anymore. Not the kind that separates, only the kind that heals. She hit send. "Hi, Mom. Miss you." Then she placed the phone down, leaned back against her trailer wall, and let herself breathe. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything. Not to the cameras, not to the world, not even to herself, because someone had sat beside her, without asking her to be strong, and that had made all the difference. The shadow and the spark following week on set felt smoother. Not because the scenes were easier, but because something in Sydney had shifted. It wasn't that she had stopped hurting, it was that she had stopped hiding. She still woke up, with a weight in her chest some mornings, but now she let herself feel it. She didn't bury it under fake smiles or pretend strength. She had stopped rehearsing her emotions for the sake of others, and she wasn't alone. Keanu noticed everything, even when no one else did. When Sydney showed up early one day, he didn't ask why. He simply handed her a coffee and sat with her on the empty soundstage floor. They didn't talk much. Sometimes their silence said more than words ever could. But not everyone understood. Some crew members whispered. They wondered why a man like Keanu, a veteran actor known for his calm presence and quiet strength, was spending so much time with a rising star like Sweeney. Some said it was favoritism. Others claimed it was strategy. Keanu ignored them. So did Sweeney. Until one afternoon, during a break, Sweeney overheard two assistants talking near the wardrobe trailer. She's lucky she's pretty. She wasn't crying on set. No way she'd get that kind of attention from Keanu. Froze. The words weren't meant for her. But they landed like a punch. She stepped away quietly and locked herself in the trailer bathroom. For a moment, the old fear returned. That voice in her head that whispered, "They only care when you break. They only listen when you fall apart." But before the voice could grow louder, her phone buzzed. A message from Keanu. "Outside when you're ready? No rush." She stared at the screen. No pressure, no demand. Just presence. 20 minutes later, she walked outside. Keanu was sitting on a bench near the catering tent, his back to the sun, reading a worn-out paperback. He looked up gently, closed the book, and moved over without a word. Sweeney sat beside him. "I heard what they said," she said quietly. Keanu nodded. "I figured, do you think they're right?" He paused, thinking carefully. "Does it matter what they think?" "Shouldn't," she whispered, "but it does." He looked at her then, eyes steady. "I've been called selfish for giving too much, fake for being quiet, cold for protecting my peace. People will say what they want, but the truth doesn't need to shout." Sweeney closed her eyes. "What if I'm not strong enough for this industry?" Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Right. Do you think strength is never falling?" "I think strength is not being afraid to stand back up." He smiled. "Then you already have it." Long pause passed. Then Sweeney asked, something she hadn't dared say out loud before. "Do you ever get tired of being everyone's safe place?" Keanu took a deep breath. "Yes," he said honestly, "but I'd rather be that than someone who adds to their storm." Sweeney looked at him not as a co-star, not even as a friend, but as a mirror. He wasn't perfect. He was human, scarred but steady. Later that day, as they filmed a heavy emotional scene, Sweeney stood in front of the camera, trembling but grounded. This time there were no tears, just raw, quiet strength. The director didn't say cut. He just whispered, "Beautiful." And when the scene ended, everyone clapped. But Sweeney didn't turn to the crew. She turned to Keanu, standing behind the monitor, giving her that small nod, again the same nod he gave her when she first broke down. After the shoot wrapped, Sweeney approached the two assistants she had overheard earlier. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cold. She simply said, "You don't have to understand my pain, but please don't use it to measure my worth." They were silent. Keanu watched from a distance, proud but quiet. That night, Sweeney went home and opened an old notebook. It was one she used to write in before fame, before Hollywood, before everything became so loud. She wrote one line: "I'm learning to love the silence that once scared me." And for the first time in weeks, she slept without waking in the middle of the night, because she had finally learned the truth. You don't have to prove yourself to heal. You just have to keep showing up. The moment they all noticed, said set was buzzing again. The studio had just received early cuts of the scenes Sweeney and Keanu had filmed together. Producers called it unexpected magic. Executives who had once questioned casting now sent quiet praise. There was talk of awards, whispers of future projects. Even the tabloids had caught wind of their on-screen chemistry. But none of that mattered to Sweeney, because this wasn't about the role anymore. It was about the woman she was, becoming behind the scenes. Each morning, she arrived a little earlier. Each evening, she stayed a little longer. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she finally felt connected not just to the work, but to herself. And somehow, Keanu always matched her pace. When she walked quietly to the edge of the soundstage to center herself before filming, he'd walk a few steps behind, never crowding her space. When she needed to rehearse lines at midnight, He'd meet her in the old rehearsal room with a flashlight and a bottle of water. Always present. Never demanding, but one day, something changed. They were filming a scene that took place during a storm-heavy dialogue. Emotional tension, tears written into the script. Rain machines were positioned, thunder effects tested. The crew was ready. Sydney wasn't. Something had shifted that morning. A phone call from home. Her mother's voice shaken, exhausted. Her younger brother had been in a small car accident. It's nothing fatal, but enough to shake the ground beneath her still. She showed up makeup, covered the shadows under her eyes. Wardrobe zipped her into a rain-soaked coat. The director gave a thumbs up. Keanu noticed the second she stepped into frame, not just because of how she walked, but how her eyes refused to meet anyone else's. She was there, but she wasn't present. When the camera rolled, she started her lines, but halfway through, her voice cracked. Her body trembled. She tried to push through it. She had done it before. But today it felt impossible. The director called, "Cut," but Sydney didn't stop. She kept speaking. Lines turned into rambling. The script fell apart. Tears became real. And just when the crew started to move toward her, Keanu walked into the rain. They hadn't rehearsed this part. The scene didn't call for him to be there, but he stepped in anyway quietly. Gently stood in front of her and placed his hand on her shoulder. She looked up, confused at first, and then she broke completely. Her sobs echoed through the fake thunder. Her knees gave in. Ah! Keanu caught her before she hit the wet ground. Oh yeah. Rain machine kept pouring, but no one moved to shut it off. The crew watched in stunned silence. He didn't carry her off set. He didn't whisper anything dramatic. He just held her in the rain, like a brother would hold a sister. Like a friend would hold someone who forgot how to stand. Eventually, the rain stopped. Sydney pulled back slowly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," Keanu said. It was honest. "I messed it up. You made it real." The director approached them slowly. "We're keeping that," he said gently. "If you're okay with it, Sydney." She nodded. She didn't care about being perfect anymore. She just wanted to be honest. Word spread fast. People across the lot replayed the footage again and again. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. A-list actors watched it in their trailers. Production assistants whispered about it over lunch. Someone anonymously uploaded a short behind-the-scenes clip. Within hours, it went viral. Not for the performance, but for the way Keanu stepped into the storm. Comments flooded in. "This is what real kindness looks like. No one teaches you how to care like this." Keanu didn't just act, he showed up. Sydney didn't read the comments. She didn't need to. She felt the truth in her bones. That evening after wrap, she found Keanu near the lighting rig. Sipping warm tea from a paper cup, she sat beside him. "You always know," she said softly. "I don't," he replied. "I just listen." "To what?" "The silence between the noise. It always tells you more than the words." They sat there, sipping tea, watching the crew pack up, and that's when Sydney realized something that brought tears to her eyes. She had spent years performing, smiling when she was breaking, laughing when she wanted to scream, and now, finally, she was being seen, not for the image, not for the press, but for the person underneath, and the one who saw her most clearly was the man who never needed her to explain. When silence turned into strength, that was a quiet Sunday morning when Sydney stepped onto the lot, alone. No filming was scheduled that day. The studio had given everyone a break after an intense week, but she couldn't stay home. Her heart was restless, her thoughts louder than usual. So she returned to the only place that had started to feel like home, the set where she had broken, healed, and finally stood tall again. She walked through the empty soundstage, her footsteps echoing. The cameras were covered, the lights turned off. But the energy lingered. She could still feel the rain, not the artificial kind from the machines, but the real one, the one that had poured out from her soul the moment. She collapsed into Keanu's arms. She sat down in the middle of the space and closed her eyes. How did I get here? She thought. Not in Hollywood. Not in this production. but in this version of herself. The girl who once feared being seen was now learning to stand in the light. The actress who measured her worth by applause was now finding strength in stillness. Sydney opened her eyes when she heard the door creak. Keanu walked in, holding a small paper bag and 2 coffees. He smiled. I figured you'd be here. How? 'Cause I've been where you are. He sat beside her, handing her the coffee. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. Then Sydney said, I'm not scared of crying anymore. Keanu looked at her. With calm pride, good. Crying's not weakness. Pretending you're fine when you're not, that's exhausting. She nodded. But now I want more. More. More than surviving. I want to create. I want to lead. I want to show people. That strength doesn't mean silence. Keanu smiled again. Then do it. I don't know how. You already started? The moment you broke down and chose to come back the next day, that was leadership. Honesty always leads. They sat there, surrounded by props and forgotten scripts, and then Sydney said something she hadn't told anyone. I was going to walk away from this film. Keanu didn't react. That day, when I froze on set, I went to my trailer and packed my things. I thought, maybe this wasn't for me anymore. Maybe I had nothing left to give. What changed your mind? You did, she whispered. You didn't tell me to stay. You didn't try to fix me. You just sat there. And it made me feel worth it. It's like I wasn't just a problem to be solved. He looked down at his cup, swirling the last of the coffee. People think helping someone means having the right words, he said. But most of the time it just means being there when the world feels too loud. She wiped a tear from her cheek and laughed softly. You really are the kindest man in Hollywood? Keanu shook his head. I'm just someone who learned that silence, when held with care, can save people. By the end of the week, something unexpected happened. The producers called Sydney into a meeting. They wanted her to speak at a studio mentorship event for young actors. Not as a celebrity, not as a star, but as someone who had faced the storm and stayed. She hesitated. Why me? She asked. One of the producers said, because every intern on this lot saw how you carried yourself these past few weeks. Talk about it when you're not around. If they don't see a celebrity, they see a human being. And that's the kind of voice we want them to learn from. The night of the event, Sydney stood backstage with shaking hands. Keanu was there. You don't have to be perfect, he told her. I know, she said. I just want to be real. When she stepped onto the stage, the lights hit her face, but this time, she wasn't performing. She spoke about fear, about pressure, about that day she collapsed in the rain and the man who sat beside her without a word. She didn't name him. She didn't need to. Because what mattered wasn't who helped her. What mattered was that someone did. And because of that moment, she had learned how to help herself and how to be that someone for others. The room was quiet when she finished. Then came the applause. But Sydney didn't look toward. It's a crowd. She looked toward the side of the stage, where Keanu stood with his arms crossed, his eyes soft. He didn't clap. He just gave her the same small nod, the one that had become her anchor. And in that nod, she saw everything she needed to move forward. The day she stood for someone else's final week of shooting arrived faster than anyone expected. The last scenes were being prepared, and the energy on set was both electric and heavy. This film had started as just another role for Sydney, but it had become something else, something much deeper, something personal. She had changed, and the people around her felt it. Her voice was steadier, her presence calmer. The fear that once haunted her had been replaced with something stronger clarity. Not perfection, not confidence without doubt, but the kind of strength that grows from falling and choosing to rise anyway. On the last day of filming, the director gathered the entire cast and crew. He stood in front of them, eyes glassy, voice raw. This movie, he said, is not just about story, it's about heart. And some of the strongest hearts I've ever seen stood on this set. Everyone clapped, but Sydney stayed quiet, hands in her pockets, eyes on the floor, not out of shyness, but humility. She had learned that real power doesn't need a spotlight. Keanu stood a few feet away. watching her with the same steady kindness he'd shown since the beginning. After the final scene wrapped and the cameras stopped rolling, small celebration started. People hugged, laughed, posed for pictures, balloons floated, and someone handed out cupcakes with the movie's logo. But just as the music got louder, Sydney noticed something. A young actress and extra, who had been on set a few times, was standing alone near the back. She was gripping her phone tightly, blinking hard, trying not to cry. Sydney didn't hesitate. She walked over and gently touched the girl's shoulder. "Hey," Sydney said softly. "You okay?" The girl nodded too fast. "Yes. No. I'm just overwhelmed." Sydney smiled kindly. "It's okay to be overwhelmed. This place can feel like too much sometimes." The girl finally let out a shaky breath. "I messed up my last take. I thought I was ready for this world, but maybe I'm not. I just feel invisible here." Sydney knelt a little to meet her eyes. "I once felt the same. On this very set," she said, "but someone saw me, really saw me. And that made all the difference." The girl looked up, eyes wide. "Was it Keanu?" Sydney chuckled. "Yeah. He sat beside me when I broke down. Didn't say a word. Just made space for me to be human." The girl blinked. "I wish someone would do that for me." Sydney took a breath. "I will. And right." There, she did the one thing Keanu had taught her, not through words, but by example. She sat right beside the girl. No cameras, no audience, just one soul telling another. "You matter." Keanu, standing at a distance, saw it all. And for the first time in a long while, he let a quiet tear fall. Not out of sadness, but pride. Later that evening, when the crew began packing up, Sydney found herself alone again on set. Everything had been cleared. The lights were being shut off one by one. She stood in the middle of the stage where it all started, the place where she broke down, the place where she healed. Keanu approached, his footsteps soft as always. "You're different," he said. "Better." She asked. "No," he said gently. "Just more. You." She smiled. "You once told me peace isn't something you're born with, that it's something you build." "I still believe that," he said. "Well," Sydney whispered, looking around. "I think this place helped me build it," he nodded. "And now you'll carry it into the next place." As they walked toward the exit together, Keanu looked at her one last time. "You don't need me to sit beside you anymore," he said. "You've become the person who sits beside others." She didn't cry, not this time, because this ending wasn't about loss. It was about becoming. As they reached the door, Sydney turned around one last time and looked at the set. "This place broke me," she said. "But it also gave me back to myself." Keanu nodded. "The most powerful scenes," he said, "aren't the ones we film, they're the ones we live." And with that, they stepped out into the night. The stars above them didn't shine any brighter than usual, but inside her, something did. Because she had discovered the truth that so many people miss, that kindness in silence can echo louder than any applause.